Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the second decade of the 13th century, the crusading movement, battered and humiliated by the treachery of the Fourth Crusade and the scandal of Constantinople, attempted to return to its original, sacred purpose. Pope Innocent III, the architect of so many triumphs and so many disasters, had not lived to see the fulfillment of his greatest ambition, a new crusade that would strike at the heart of the Muslim power and recover the holy city of Jerusalem. He had died in 1216, his dreams of a unified, purified Christendom still unfulfilled, but the machinery of the crusade that he had set in motion continued to grind forward under his successor, Pope Honorius III. The new crusade, the fifth of its kind, was conceived as a return to the strategic vision that had been so tragically abandoned by the Venetians and the Crusader barons: the invasion of Egypt, the richest and most vulnerable province of the Ayyubid Empire, the capture of the great port of Damietta, and the use of that conquest as a bargaining chip to secure the return of Jerusalem. The strategic logic of the Egyptian campaign was, on paper, impeccable. Egypt was the granary of the Muslim world, the source of the wealth, the manpower, and the naval power that had sustained the Ayyubid dynasty since the days of Saladin. The Nile Delta, with its intricate network of waterways, its fertile fields, and its prosperous cities, was the soft underbelly of the Muslim Empire, a vulnerable, exposed target that was far easier to attack and to hold than the mountainous, arid, and heavily fortified interior of Palestine. The capture of Damietta, which was the key to the entire delta, would give the Crusaders a stranglehold on the Egyptian economy, a base of operations that could be supplied by sea, and a prize of such immense value that the Ayyubid Sultan, Al-Kamil, the nephew of Saladin, would have no choice but to negotiate, to offer the return of Jerusalem in exchange for the Crusader withdrawal. The plan, which was the product of decades of the strategic thought and the bitter experience, was the brainchild of the Crusader leadership and the military orders. The Templar Order, which had been the backbone of the Crusader military for over a century, was the essential, indispensable partner in the Egyptian campaign. The white-mantled knights, who had extensive experience in the Nile Delta from the campaigns of the late 12th century, understood the terrain, the climate, and the enemy that the Crusaders would face. The Templar fleet, which was the most powerful and the most efficient naval force in the Crusader kingdom, was the key to the transportation of the army, the supply of the siege, and the blockade of the Egyptian coast. The Templar Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who had been elected in 1219, was a seasoned veteran of the wars in the Holy Land and a skilled, pragmatic commander who was deeply committed to the Egyptian strategy. The white-mantled knights, who had been starved of the reinforcements and the resources for decades, were eager for a decisive, offensive campaign that would, at long last, deliver the victory that had eluded the Crusaders since the fall of Jerusalem. The army that assembled at Acre in the spring of 1218 was a diverse, polyglot, and deeply fractious coalition, a reflection of the strengths and the weaknesses of the crusading movement. The core of the army was composed of the knights and the sergeants of the military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, the professional, disciplined, and experienced soldiers who were the backbone of the Crusader military. The secular leadership was provided by King John of Brienne, the titular king of Jerusalem, a capable, experienced, and deeply frustrated commander who had spent his entire reign struggling to defend the fragile, vulnerable Crusader kingdom with the inadequate, unreliable, and often deeply disappointing resources. The army was supplemented by the contingents of the Crusaders from Europe, the French, the German, the Italian, and the English knights who had taken the cross and who had sailed to the Holy Land in response to the papal call, their enthusiasm and their piety often unmatched by their discipline or their understanding of the local conditions. The fleet that carried the Crusader army to the shores of Egypt was a magnificent, awe-inspiring, and deeply reassuring sight, a testament to the naval power of the Crusader kingdom and the Italian maritime republics. The Templar galleys, which were the most formidable warships in the eastern Mediterranean, led the way, their white banners snapping in the wind, their decks crowded with the knights and the sergeants who would be the spearhead of the assault. The transport ships, which were provided by the merchants of Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, carried the thousands of the infantry, the archers, the engineers, and the camp followers who were essential for the siege operations. The fleet, which was the largest and the most powerful Crusader naval force since the Third Crusade, sailed south along the coast of Palestine, its destination the mouth of the Nile, its objective the city of Damietta, the key to the conquest of Egypt and the recovery of Jerusalem. The Muslim world, which had been watching the Crusader preparations with a mixture of the alarm, the calculation, and the grim, fatalistic resignation, was in a state of the complex, shifting, and deeply unstable political equilibrium. The Ayyubid Empire, which had been founded by Saladin, had fragmented after his death into a collection of the rival principalities, the sultans of Egypt, Damascus, and Aleppo, engaged in a constant, grinding, and mutually destructive struggle for the supremacy. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, who was the nephew of Saladin and the most powerful of the Ayyubid princes, was a capable, intelligent, and pragmatic ruler, but he was also deeply distracted by the threats from his own family, his brother Al-Muazzam of Damascus and his other rivals. The Crusader invasion, which was a serious, immediate, and existential threat to his realm, was also, in a strange, paradoxical way, a unifying force, a common enemy that could, perhaps, bring the squabbling Ayyubid princes together. The Templar intelligence network, which extended across the entire Muslim world and which was the most extensive and the most reliable source of the information in the Crusader kingdom, had been providing the Grand Master with the detailed, accurate, and deeply concerning reports on the political situation in Egypt. The White-Mantled Knights, who had the agents and the informants in the court of Al-Kamil and in the markets of Alexandria and Damietta, knew that the Sultan was a formidable, determined, and resourceful enemy, a man who would not easily be intimidated or defeated. The Templars, who were the realists and the pragmatists, understood that the Egyptian campaign would be a long, difficult, and dangerous undertaking, a campaign that would test the resources, the endurance, and the strategic wisdom of the Crusader army to their absolute limits. The stage was set for a confrontation that would, in the end, prove to be one of the most catastrophic and the most bitterly disappointing of all the Crusades. The Crusader fleet, which was the largest and the most formidable naval force that had been assembled since the Third Crusade, arrived off the coast of Egypt in May 1218, its sails a vast, white cloud on the horizon, its decks crowded with the knights, the sergeants, and the infantry who were eager for the battle and the glory. The target of the invasion was the city of Damietta, a prosperous, heavily fortified port that was located on the eastern branch of the Nile, about 10 kilometers from the sea. Damietta, which was the key to the entire delta, was protected by a massive, triple wall, a deep, wide moat, and a formidable, complex system of the towers, the bastions, and the outworks that had been strengthened and reinforced over the decades. The city, which was the primary commercial hub of the region, was filled with the merchants, the artisans, and the soldiers, its population swollen by the refugees who had fled the advancing Crusader army. The strategic importance of Damietta, which was the central, overriding objective of the entire campaign, cannot be overstated. The city controlled the access to the Nile, the great river that was the lifeblood of Egypt, the source of the water, the transportation, and the agricultural fertility that sustained the entire country. The capture of Damietta would give the Crusaders a secure, fortified base on the Egyptian coast, a port that could be supplied by the fleet, and a launching pad for the advance up the Nile toward Cairo, the capital of the Ayyubid Empire. The loss of Damietta, which was the constant, nagging nightmare of Sultan al-Kamil, would be a catastrophic, potentially fatal blow to the Muslim power in Egypt, a blow that could trigger the collapse of the Ayyubid dynasty and the disintegration of the entire Muslim resistance to the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Templar role in the initial landings was, as always, the spearhead, the vanguard, the sharp, deadly point of the Crusader assault. The white-mantled knights, who were the most experienced and the most disciplined amphibious warriors in the Christian army, led the first wave of the boats that surged toward the shore, their swords drawn, their shields raised, their eyes fixed on the enemy who waited behind the sand dunes and the palm groves. The Templar galleys, which were commanded by the seasoned, veteran captains, provided the covering fire, their crossbowmen and their archers raining the bolts and the arrows on the Muslim defenders, their catapults hurling the stones and the Greek fire on the fortifications. The landing, which was conducted under a hail of the enemy missiles and the constant, nagging harassment of the Muslim light cavalry, was a chaotic, brutal, and ultimately successful operation, the Crusaders establishing a secure beachhead and driving the defenders back toward the walls of Damietta. The siege operations against Damietta, which began in the summer of 1218, were a slow, grinding, and immensely costly affair, a test of the endurance, the resources, and the strategic patience of both sides. The Crusader army, which had established a vast, sprawling camp on the landward side of the city, was confronted with a formidable, triple ring of the fortifications that seemed, at first, almost impregnable. The walls of Damietta, which were constructed of the massive, finely cut limestone blocks, rose to a height of over 20 meters, their towers, which were placed at the regular intervals, bristling with the mangonels, the ballistae, and the skilled, determined archers. The moat, which was deep, wide, and filled with the murky, stagnant water of the Nile, was a formidable, almost insuperable obstacle, a death trap that would swallow the bodies of the thousands of the Crusader soldiers who would attempt to cross it. The Templar engineers, who were the masters of the siege warfare and the experts in the construction of the siege engines, were the essential, indispensable assets in the long, grinding campaign against the walls of Damietta. The white-mantled knights, who had the decades of the experience in the sieges of the Holy Land and who had studied the latest, most advanced techniques of the military engineering, supervised the construction of the massive trebuchets, the great counterweight-powered machines that could hurl the stones weighing over 100 kilograms with a devastating, terrifying accuracy. The Templar sappers, who were the courageous, the skilled, and the often fatally unlucky specialists in the mining and the tunneling, dug the long, dark, and suffocating passages beneath the walls, their objective the collapse of the fortifications, their constant, nagging companions the fear of the collapse, the Muslim defense of Damietta, which was commanded by the Sultan's most trusted and most experienced generals, was a determined, resourceful, and deeply frustrating obstacle to the Crusader progress. The garrison, which was composed of the elite Mamluk cavalry, the Kurdish heavy infantry, and the local Egyptian levies, was well supplied, well armed, and highly motivated, its soldiers fighting with a desperate, fanatical courage that was born of the knowledge that the fate of Egypt, and of the entire Muslim world, hung in the balance. The Sultan, al-Kamil, who was encamped with his main army a few miles to the south, maintained a constant, grinding pressure on the Crusader camp, his light cavalry harassing the supply lines, his raiding parties attacking the isolated, vulnerable outposts, his messengers slipping through the blockade to maintain the morale and the communication with the beleaguered garrison. The Templar patrols and the counter-raids, which were the daily, grinding, and deeply unglamorous reality of the siege, were the essential, indispensable operations that kept the Crusader army alive and the Muslim pressure at bay. The white-mantled knights, who were the masters of the mobile, fast-moving, and hard-hitting warfare, led the mounted columns that scoured the countryside for the supplies, the fodder, and the intelligence, their lances and their swords the constant, nagging threat that kept the Muslim raiders at a cautious, respectful distance. The Templar sergeants, who were the backbone of the patrol operations, spent the long, hot, and exhausting days in the saddle, their eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale dust cloud that signaled the approach of the enemy, their hands never far from the hilts of their swords. The siege of Damietta, which was the long, grinding, and deeply frustrating stalemate, was the test of the patience and the endurance. The arrival of the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius of Albano, in the Crusader camp at Damietta in the autumn of 1218, was a moment of the profound, fateful, and ultimately catastrophic significance. Pelagius, who was a Spanish churchman of the immense, towering ambition and the fanatical, uncompromising piety, had been dispatched by Pope Honorius III to assume the spiritual and, increasingly, the military command of the crusade, his authority, in theory, subordinate to that of King John of Brienne, but his influence, in practice, the dominant, the overwhelming, and the deeply divisive force. The legate, who was a man of the book and the cloister, not of the camp and the battlefield, arrived in Egypt with a retinue of the Italian clerics, the papal bureaucrats, and the ambitious, land-hungry barons, his mind filled with the grand, strategic visions, his heart burning with the righteous, holy zeal, his ears closed to the cautious, the pragmatic, and the deeply inconvenient advice of the experienced local commanders. The relationship between Pelagius and King John of Brienne, which was the central, defining, and ultimately fatal dynamic of the Fifth Crusade, was a clash of the two very different personalities, the two very different visions, and the two very different approaches to the Holy War. John of Brienne, who was the veteran of the decades of the grinding, defensive warfare in the Holy Land, was a cautious, pragmatic, and deeply realistic commander, a man who understood the terrain, the enemy, and the immense, unforgiving challenges of the Egyptian campaign. He advocated a patient, methodical strategy, the consolidation of the Crusader gains, the careful, prudent negotiation with the Sultan, and the acceptance of the generous, unprecedented, and deeply tempting offer that Al-Kamil had made, the return of Jerusalem and the entire, pre-1187 Crusader kingdom in exchange for the withdrawal from Egypt. Pelagius, who was the fanatical, the uncompromising, and the deeply ignorant zealot, rejected the Sultan's offer with the contemptuous, dismissive arrogance, his mind fixed on the total, the absolute, and the utterly impossible conquest of Egypt and the destruction of the Muslim power. The Templar position in the growing, bitter, and increasingly dangerous conflict between Pelagius and John of Brienne was a delicate, precarious, and deeply uncomfortable balancing act. The white-mantled knights, who were the loyal, obedient servants of the papacy, could not, in good conscience, openly oppose the papal legate, a defiance that would have been the grounds for the immediate, severe, and potentially fatal repercussions. Yet the Templars, who were the experienced, the pragmatic, and the deeply knowledgeable soldiers, could not, in good conscience, support the legate's reckless, suicidal, and utterly unrealistic strategy, a strategy that was leading the Crusader army, step by inexorable step, toward the disaster. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who was a skilled, experienced, and deeply frustrated diplomat, attempted to mediate between the two warring camps, his quiet, steady, and ultimately powerless voice of the reason drowned out by the shouting, the posturing, and the fanatical, holy zeal. The Sultan's offer of Jerusalem, which was the most generous, the most unprecedented, and the most deeply tempting proposal that had ever been made by a Muslim ruler to the Crusaders, was the central, agonizing, and ultimately tragic crux of the entire campaign. Al-Kamil, who was a pragmatist and a realist, recognized that the Crusader presence in Egypt was a threat to his own, fragile, and deeply unstable political position, and he was prepared to pay a vast, almost unimaginable, price to secure the withdrawal of the Christian army. The offer, which was conveyed to the Crusader leaders through the intermediaries, included the return of Jerusalem, the restoration of the pre-1187 Crusader kingdom, the release of all the Christian prisoners, and a long-term truce that would allow the Crusader states to recover and to rebuild. The Templars, who were the realists and the pragmatists, were the most enthusiastic and the most vocal supporters of the acceptance of the Sultan's offer, their Grand Master arguing, with the cold, the clear, and the irrefutable logic, that the offer was the best, the most favorable, and the most achievable outcome that the Crusade could possibly hope for. The refusal of Pelagius, which was the single, most catastrophic, and the most bitterly regretted decision of the entire Fifth Crusade, was the product of the fanaticism, the ignorance, and the arrogant, overweening pride. The legate, who was convinced that the God was on his side and that the total, the absolute, and the glorious victory was within his grasp, dismissed the Sultan's offer as a trick, a sign of the weakness, and a temptation of the devil, his mind fixed on the impossible, the glorious, and the utterly delusional dream of the conquest of Cairo and the destruction of the Muslim power. The Templars, who had argued, pleaded, and begged for the acceptance of the offer, were the silent, the bitter, and the deeply disillusioned witnesses to the legate's folly, their white mantles a symbol of the wisdom, the experience, and the common sense that had been so tragically, so catastrophically, and so irrevocably ignored. The fall of the Chain Tower, which was the formidable, heavily fortified, and strategically vital outwork that guarded the entrance to the harbor of Damietta, was the first, great, and hard-won triumph of the Crusader siege operations. The tower, which was a massive, multi-storied structure that was built on an island in the middle of the Nile, was connected to the city by a great, iron chain that could be raised to block the passage of the ships, and its capture was the essential, indispensable prerequisite for the naval blockade of Damietta. The Crusader assaults on the tower, which were launched repeatedly and which were repulsed with the heavy, bloody losses, were a testament to the courage and the determination of the Christian soldiers, but also to the formidable, almost insuperable strength of the Muslim defenses. The Templar role in the assault on the Chain Tower was, as always, the spearhead, the vanguard, the sharp, deadly point of the attack. The white-mantled knights, who had the experience and the expertise in the amphibious and the siege operations, led the storming parties, their ladders and their grappling hooks the precarious, fragile, and often fatally inadequate means of the ascent, their swords and their shields the only protection against the rain of the arrows, the stones, and the boiling oil that poured down from the construction of the floating siege engines, which was the ingenious, the innovative, and the ultimately decisive response to the challenge of the Chain Tower, was a triumph of the Crusader engineering and the ingenuity. The Templar engineers, who were the masters of the siege warfare, supervised the construction of the massive, floating platforms, the great, wooden structures that were mounted on the ships and that were equipped with the scaling ladders, the drawbridges, and the assault towers. The floating engines, which were the terrifying, unprecedented, and deeply alarming sight for the Muslim defenders, were the key to the capture of the tower, their height and their firepower overwhelming the defenses, their assault parties storming the battlements and driving the garrison into the river. The capture of the Chain Tower, which occurred in August 1218 after the months of the bloody, grinding, and deeply frustrating assaults, was a moment of the immense, jubilant, and deeply relieved triumph for the Crusader army. The great, iron chain, which had been the impassable, formidable barrier to the naval advance, was cut, its severed ends splashing into the waters of the Nile, the harbor of Damietta now open to the Crusader fleet. The Templar galleys, which were the first ships to enter the harbor, were the spearhead of the naval offensive, their crews the cheering, the triumphant, and the deeply relieved brothers who had seen their comrades fall in the long, bitter struggle for the tower. The capture of the tower, which was the first major victory of the campaign, was the promise of the further, greater, and more glorious triumphs to come. The impact of the fall of the Chain Tower on the morale of the garrison and the Sultan's army was a profound, the demoralizing, and the deeply unsettling blow. The garrison of Damietta, which had watched the destruction of their most formidable, most trusted, and most essential defense, was plunged into the gloom, the despair, and the growing, nagging fear of the inevitable, approaching defeat. The Sultan, Al-Kamil, who was encamped with his main army, was shaken by the loss, his strategic calculations thrown into the disarray, his confidence in the ultimate, inevitable victory now the undermined, the fragile, and the deeply uncertain. The fall of the tower, which was the triumph of the Crusader arms, was also the warning, the premonition, and the harbinger of the disasters that were, in the fullness of the time, to engulf the Christian army. The Templar assessment of the situation after the fall of the Chain Tower was a cautious, measured, and deeply realistic one, a stark contrast to the triumphalists, the overconfident, and the deeply unrealistic pronouncements of the Papal Legate. The white-mantled knights, who were the realists and the pragmatists, recognized that the capture of the tower, while a significant and a hard-won victory, was only the first, small step in the long, difficult, and deeply uncertain campaign that lay ahead. The city of Damietta, which was still the formidable, heavily fortified, and well-garrisoned stronghold, had not fallen, and the Sultan's army, which was still the intact, the powerful, and the deeply dangerous force, was still the constant, nagging, and deeply threatening presence. The Templars, who were the advocates of the caution and the negotiation, urged the acceptance of the Sultan's generous offer, their voices the quiet, the steady, and the ultimately powerless counterweight to the legate's fanatical, reckless, and deeply suicidal ambition. The long siege of Damietta, which dragged on through the autumn of 1218, the entire year of 1219, and into the summer of 1220, was a slow, grinding, and deeply agonizing ordeal, a test of the endurance, the resources, and the morale of both the besiegers and the besieged. The city, which was the formidable, heavily fortified, and deeply resilient stronghold, was defended by the garrison that was the well-supplied, the highly motivated, and the fanatically determined, its soldiers fighting with the desperate, the courageous, and the utterly stubborn refusal to surrender. The Crusader army, which was encamped in the vast, sprawling, and increasingly disease-ridden and demoralized camp outside the walls, was subjected to the constant, grinding pressure of the enemy attacks, the scorching, unforgiving Egyptian sun, and the periodic, devastating outbreaks of the disease that swept through the unsanitary, overcrowded, and deeply unhealthy encampment. The epidemics that ravaged the Crusader camp during the long siege were the silent, the insidious, and the utterly devastating killers, the invisible, the implacable, and the deeply terrifying enemies that no amount of the courage, the skill, or the piety could defeat. The dysentery, the typhus, the malaria, and the countless other, unnamed diseases that were the constant, nagging companions of the medieval siege warfare, swept through the camp in the waves, their victims the thousands of the soldiers, the knights, and the camp followers, their bodies the weakened, the emaciated, and the utterly broken shells, their deaths the slow, the agonizing, and the deeply undignified. The Templar Hospital, which was the large, well-organized, and deeply committed medical facility that the order had established in the camp, was the overwhelmed, the exhausted, and the deeply compassionate center of the care for the sick and the dying, the white-mantled brothers working the long, the grueling, and the deeply harrowing hours to tend to the victims. The famine that accompanied the epidemics was the product of the Sultan's blockade, the constant, grinding harassment of the Crusader supply lines, and the sheer, overwhelming difficulty of provisioning the large, static, and deeply hungry army on the hostile, foreign soil. The food supplies, which were brought by the ships from Acre and from the European ports, were the often inadequate, the frequently spoiled, and the always deeply and frustratingly expensive, the prices the inflated, the extortionate, and the utterly beyond the reach of the common soldier. The Templar commissary, which was the efficient, the organized, and the deeply essential logistical operation, managed the distribution of the food with a calm, methodical, and ultimately successful competence. But even the Templar resources were the strained, the stretched, and the deeply insufficient to prevent the hunger, the malnutrition, and the slow, agonizing starvation that stalked the camp. The Muslim relief efforts, which were the constant, the grinding, and the deeply effective harassment of the Crusader siege operations, were the primary, the essential, and the deeply frustrating obstacle to the capture of Damietta. Sultan al-Kamil, who was the master of the mobile, fast-moving, and hard-hitting warfare, maintained the constant, nagging pressure on the Crusader camp, his light cavalry the attacking the supply convoys, his raiding parties the burning the fields and the villages, his fleet the contesting the control of the river and the sea lanes. The Templar patrols, which were the daily, the dangerous, and the deeply unglamorous operations that kept the Muslim raiders at bay, were the essential, the indispensable, and the deeply costly shield that protected the Crusader army from the complete, the catastrophic, and the utterly fatal encirclement and the annihilation. The political infighting in the Crusader camp, which was the constant, the corrosive, and the deeply destructive undercurrent of the entire siege, was the reflection of the deep, irreconcilable, and ultimately fatal divisions that had plagued the crusading movement since its inception. The conflict between Pelagius and John of Brienne, which was the central, the dominant, and the most bitterly contested of these disputes, was the constant, the nagging, and the deeply paralyzing distraction that sapped the morale, the unity, and the strategic effectiveness of the Christian army. The Templars, who were the neutral, the impartial, and the deeply frustrated mediators, attempted to bridge the gap between the two warring camps, their Grand Master the quiet, the steady, and the ultimately powerless voice of the reason and the compromise. The Templar morale during the fall of Damietta, which occurred on November 5, 1219, after a siege of over 18 months, was a moment of the immense, the jubilant, and the deeply relieved triumph for the Crusader army, a victory that seemed, for a brief, glorious moment, to justify all of the suffering, the sacrifice, and the loss. The city, which had been reduced to a smoking, stinking, and deeply desolate ruin by the months of the relentless bombardment, the famine, and the disease, was finally, mercifully, and irrevocably in the Christian hands. The garrison, which had been decimated by the casualties, the starvation, and the epidemic, was a ghostly, skeletal remnant of the proud, formidable force that had defended the city, its soldiers the emaciated, the exhausted, and the utterly broken men who stumbled out of the gates to surrender to the triumphant Crusaders. The Templar entry into the captured city was a moment of the profound, the solemn, and the deeply emotional significance for the white-mantled knights. The brothers, who had fought and bled and died in the long, grinding, and deeply costly siege, who had seen their comrades fall in the assaults on the walls and the tower, and who had endured the mud, the disease, and the famine of the camp, were the first to enter the captured city, their white mantles a symbol of the sacrifice, the courage, and the ultimate, hard-won triumph. The Templar Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who had been the constant, the steady, and the deeply reassuring presence throughout the ordeal, led his knights in a solemn, reverent procession through the shattered streets, their prayers the quiet, the heartfelt, and the deeply grateful thanksgiving to the God who had granted them the victory. The strategic implications of the fall of Damietta were immense, far-reaching, and deeply complex, a mixture of the opportunity, the danger, and the profound, unsettling uncertainty. The city, which was the key to the Nile Delta, was now the Crusader base, a fortified, secure, and well-supplied port that could be used as the launching pad for the advance up the river toward Cairo, the capital of the Ayyubid Empire. The Sultan, Al-Kamil, who was the deeply shaken, the profoundly alarmed, and the increasingly desperate ruler, renewed his offer of the Jerusalem and the pre-1187 kingdom, his terms the even more generous, the even more desperate, and the even more deeply tempting than before. The Crusader leadership, which was the divided, the fractious, and the deeply conflicted, was confronted with the momentous, the agonizing, and the ultimately fateful choice, to accept the Sultan's offer and to claim the victory, or to press on, deeper into the Egypt, in pursuit of the total, the absolute, and the utterly elusive triumph. The Templar position in the strategic debate that followed the fall of Damietta was the clear, the consistent, and the deeply pragmatic, a reflection of the Order's long, experienced, and deeply realistic. The Templar Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who was the seasoned, the experienced, and the deeply wise commander, was the most respected and the most influential of the neutral, the impartial, and the deeply frustrated mediators in the debate. The Grand Master, who had spent his entire adult life in the service of the temple and who had witnessed, at the first hand, the catastrophic consequences of the reckless, the arrogant, and the deeply foolish strategic decisions, was the deeply alarmed, the increasingly desperate, and the utterly powerless advocate for the caution, the negotiation, and the acceptance of the Sultan's offer. The Templar arguments, which were the clear, the logical, and the deeply compelling, were the ignored, the dismissed, and the ultimately futile, the white-mantled knights the silent, the bitter, and the deeply disillusioned witnesses to the legate's folly, their experience and their wisdom the sacrificed on the altar of the fanaticism and the ambition. The Muslim perspective on the debate, which was the watched, the waited, and the deeply calculated, was a mixture of the hope, the fear, and the cold, the ruthless, and the deeply pragmatic strategic calculation. Sultan al-Kamil, who was the shrewd, the intelligent, and the deeply patient ruler, recognized that the divisions within the Crusader camp were his greatest, his most powerful, and his most effective weapon, a weapon that he could use to destroy the Christian army without the risking the pitched battle or the prolonged, costly siege. The Sultan, who was the master of the manipulation and the deception, played a delicate, the subtle, and the deeply cynical game, his offers to the bait, his retreats to the lures, his patience to the trap that was slowly, inexorably, and fatally closing around the Crusader army. The final, fatal decision, which was the made by Pelagius over the desperate, the anguished, and the utterly ignored objections of King John and the Templars, was the product of the fanaticism, the ignorance, and the arrogant, overweening pride. The legate, who was convinced that the God was on his side and that the victory was the assured, ordered the army to prepare for the advance up the Nile toward Cairo, his mind filled with the visions of the glory, the triumph, and the total, the absolute, and the everlasting destruction of the Muslim power. The Templars, who were commanded to obey, were the silent, the grim, and the deeply fatalistic, their white mantles a symbol of the duty, the obedience, and the tragic, the inevitable, and the utterly catastrophic consequences of the legate's folly. The order to march, which was issued by Pelagius in the early summer of 1221, was the single, most catastrophic, and the most bitterly regretted command of the entire Fifth Crusade, a decision that transformed the potential, the glorious, and the deeply hoped for victory into the certain, the devastating, and the utterly humiliating defeat. The Crusader army, which had spent the months after the fall of Damietta in the idleness, the indecision, and the growing, corrosive demoralization, was now ordered to abandon the secure, the fortified, and the well-supplied base and to advance into the hostile, the treacherous, and the deeply unknown interior of the Nile Delta. The objective was Cairo, the capital of the Ayyubid Empire, the heart of the Muslim power, the goal that, if captured, would deliver the total, the absolute, and the everlasting triumph that Pelagius had promised and that the faithful had been praying for. The Templar reaction to the order was a mixture of the shock, the disbelief, and the cold, the grim, and the deeply fatalistic resignation. The white-mantled knights, who were the most experienced and the most knowledgeable soldiers in the Crusader army, understood, with the clarity that was born of the decades of the bitter, the grinding, and the deeply unforgiving warfare, that the march was a suicide mission, a plunge into the heart of the enemy territory at the worst possible season, with the inadequate supplies, the unreliable intelligence, and the deeply fractured, the demoralized, and the utterly disunited command. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who was the deeply alarmed, the increasingly desperate, and the utterly powerless leader, attempted, one last time, to persuade the legate of the folly of the decision, his arguments the clear, the logical, and the deeply compelling, his warnings the dire, the urgent, and the ultimately, tragically, and utterly ignored. The season of the march, which was the early summer, was the worst possible time for the military operations in the Nile Delta. The great river, which was the lifeblood of Egypt, was beginning its annual, immense, and utterly transformative flood, the waters the rising, the swamps the expanding, the entire landscape the transforming into a vast, treacherous, and deeply impassable morass of the mud, the water, and the dense, impenetrable vegetation. The Templar guides, who were the local, the experienced, and the deeply knowledgeable, warned of the dangers, the floods that would cut off the army's retreat, the canals that would channel the water into the camp, the mosquitoes that would spread the disease, the mud that would swallow the horses and the men. The warnings, which were the accurate, the prescient, and the deeply urgent, were the dismissed, the ignored, and the utterly contemptuously rejected by the legate and his staff. The composition of the marching army was a reflection of the deep, irreconcilable, and ultimately fatal divisions that had plagued the crusade from the beginning. King John of Brienne, who was the furious, the humiliated, and the deeply opposed to the march, was the reluctantly, the grudgingly, and the utterly resentfully participating, his authority the undermined, his counsel the ignored, his presence the symbol of the fractured, the dysfunctional, and the deeply troubled command. The Templars, who were the loyal, the obedient, and the deeply professional, were the vanguard and the rearguard of the marching column, their white mantles a familiar, reassuring, and deeply respected presence, their discipline and their courage the only, slender, and ultimately insufficient shield against the disasters that were, inexorably and unavoidably, approaching. The Muslim forces that were waiting for the Crusader advance were the numerous, the well-prepared, and the deeply confident, their morale the bolstered by the knowledge of the terrain, the season, and the enemy's folly. Sultan al-Kamil, who was the master of the strategic patience and the tactical cunning, had assembled a large, powerful, and deeply motivated army, its core the elite Mamluk cavalry, the heavy infantry, and the skilled, deadly archers. The Sultan, who had been watching the Crusader preparations with the cold, the calculating, and the deeply satisfied eye, had prepared a trap of the elegant, the devastating, and the utterly inescapable simplicity, a trap that would use the river, the flood, and the very terrain against the invading army. The Templar intelligence, which was the gathered by the Order's agents and the scouts, had been warning of the Muslim preparations for weeks, the reports the detailed, the accurate, and the deeply alarming. The white-mantled knights, who were the eyes and the ears of the Crusader army, had seen the Muslim forces gathering, the dams and the canals being prepared, the ground being prepared for the inundation, the trap being set. The warnings, which were the urgent, the desperate, and the deeply frustrated, were the ignored, the dismissed, and the utterly futile, the legate and his staff the convinced that the God was on their side and that the Muslim preparations were the signs of the weakness, the fear, and the impending collapse. The Templars, who were the realists and the pragmatists, knew, with a cold, a sick, and a deeply fatalistic certainty, that the army was marching into a disaster of the catastrophic, the devastating, and the utterly humiliating proportions. The march into the Delta, which began in July 1221, was, from its very first days, a slow, grinding, and deeply agonizing ordeal, a descent into a hell of the mud, the water. The Templar role in the march was, as always, the vanguard and the rearguard, the most dangerous, the most demanding, and the most essential positions in the marching column. The white-mantled knights, who were the most disciplined, the most experienced, and the most resilient soldiers in the army, led the way through the swamps, their scouts the probing the terrain, their engineers the constructing the makeshift bridges and the causeways, their swords the ready for the sudden, the violent, and the deeply terrifying Muslim ambushes. The Templar Rearguard, which was the shield that protected the main body from the constant, the grinding, and the deeply effective harassment of the Muslim cavalry, fought a continuous, a desperate, and a deeply costly battle, their white mantles the target of the enemy arrows, their bodies the exhausted, the wounded, and the increasingly, the desperately, the hopelessly depleted. The Muslim tactics during the march were a masterclass of the harassment, the attrition, and the psychological warfare, a perfectly executed campaign of the death by 1,000 cuts. Sultan al-Kamil, who was the master of the light cavalry tactics, had unleashed his horse archers on the Crusader column, their arrows the constant, the nagging, and the deeply terrifying rain, their attacks the sudden, the violent, and the deeply disorienting, their retreats the swift, the elusive, and the deeply frustrating. The Muslim engineers, who were the skilled, the experienced, and the deeply cunning, had been busy for the weeks, the cutting of the canals, the breaching of the dikes, the preparing of the great, the devastating, and the utterly catastrophic inundation that was to be the final, the fatal, and the utterly humiliating blow. The flooding of the Delta, which was the Sultan's masterstroke, the elegant, the devastating, and the utterly inescapable trap, began to take effect as the Crusader army advanced deeper into the swamps. The waters of the Nile, which were the rising with the annual, the immense, and the utterly unstoppable flood, were the channeled, the directed, and the deliberately unleashed by the Muslim engineers, there flowed the controlled, the manipulated, and the weaponized. The canals, which had been the dry, the empty, and the easily crossed, were the suddenly, the terrifyingly, and the utterly impassably transformed into the wide, the deep, and the swiftly flowing rivers, their waters the cutting off the Crusader line of the retreat, their currents the swirling, the treacherous, and the deeply deadly. The Templar engineers, who were the skilled, the experienced, and the deeply courageous, struggled to counter the flooding, their efforts the desperate, the heroic, and the ultimately, tragically, and utterly futile. The white-mantled knights, who were the masters of the military engineering, constructed the makeshift dams and the levees, their hands to the bleeding, their bodies to the exhausted, their spirits to the deeply, the desperately, and the increasingly hopeless. The water, which was the relentless, the implacable, and the utterly unstoppable, continued to rise, the swamps the expanding, the dry ground the shrinking, the Crusader army the trapped, the surrounded, and the utterly, terrifyingly, and irreversibly doomed. The Templar Rearguard actions during the march, which were the constant, the grinding, and the deeply heroic, were the only, slender, and ultimately insufficient shield that protected the Crusader army from the complete, the catastrophic, and the utterly fatal annihilation. The white-mantled knights, who were the fighting with a desperate, a suicidal, and a deeply inspiring courage, held off the Muslim attacks, their swords to the flashing, their lances to the thrusting, their bodies to the falling, their white mantles to the stained with the blood, the mud, and the sweat. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who was the leading his knights from the front, was a figure of the immense, the towering, and the deeply tragic heroism, his courage to the unwavering, his determination to the absolute, his heart to the breaking, his soul to the grieving for the brothers who were falling around him, his prayers to the constant, to the fervent, and to the deeply, the desperately, and the utterly unanswered. The Muslim trap, which had been prepared with the meticulous, the patient, and the deeply cunning care, was sprung in the late summer of 1221, its jaws closing around the Crusader army with a devastating, a terrifying, and an utterly inescapable finality. The waters of the Nile, which had been the rising steadily for the weeks, were the suddenly, the catastrophically, and the utterly overwhelmingly released. The great dams and the dikes that the Sultan's engineers had constructed were the breach, the waters the surging, the flooding, the engulfing the entire, vast, and deeply vulnerable Crusader camp. The knights, who were clad in the heavy, the suffocating, and the utterly impractical armor, were the struggling, the floundering, and the drowning in the mud and the water, their horses to the terrified, to the helpless, and to the deeply pitiful, their equipment to the lost, to the ruined, and to the utterly useless. The Templar response to the flooding was the immediate, the instinctive, and the deeply courageous, the white-mantled knights the rushing to the critical points, their efforts to the desperate, the heroic, and the ultimately, tragically, and utterly futile. The brothers, who were the skilled, the experienced, and the deeply determined, attempted to build the makeshift barriers, to rescue the drowning soldiers, to salvage the precious, the irreplaceable, and the rapidly disappearing supplies. The water, which was the relentless, the implacable, and the utterly unstoppable, continued to rise, the camp the transforming into a vast, the stinking, and the deeply horrific lake, the soldiers to the floundering, the screaming, and the dying, their bodies to the floating, the bloated, and the deeply tragic testament to the legate's folly. The isolation of the Crusader army, which was the complete, the absolute, and the utterly terrifying, was the final, the fatal, and the utterly humiliating consequence of the flooding. The great, swirling, and deeply treacherous waters that surrounded the camp on every side were the impassable, the inescapable, and the utterly demoralizing barrier, a prison of the water and the mud that trapped the Christian soldiers, their supplies to the exhausted, their morale to the shattered, their hope to the extinguished. The Muslim army, which was the watching from the dry, the secure, and the deeply satisfying vantage points on the surrounding high ground, was the patient, the confident, and the deeply contemptuous, its soldiers the waiting for the inevitable, the surrender, or the annihilation. The starvation and the disease that swept through the flooded camp were the final, the most devastating, and the most deeply harrowing chapter of the Crusader ordeal. The food supplies, which had been the inadequate, the spoiled, and the rapidly dwindling even before the flooding, were now the completely, the irreversibly, and the utterly catastrophically lost, the water the contaminated, the soldiers the reduced to the eating of the horses, the dogs, the rats, and in the darkest, the most desperate, and the most deeply unspoken of the moments, the flesh of the dead. The Templar brothers, who were sharing their meager, their precious, and their deeply insufficient rations with the starving soldiers, were the emaciated, the exhausted, and the deeply, the desperately, the hopelessly ill, their white mantles the stained, the tattered, and the deeply tragic symbols of the suffering and the sacrifice. The Templar prayers and the spiritual resilience, which were the slender, and the deeply tested source of the comfort and the strength in the midst of the catastrophe, were the constant, the fervent, and the deeply moving. The white-mantled knights, who were the men of the profound, the authentic, and the deeply unwavering faith, gathered in the makeshift chapels, their voices to the hoarse, to the weak, and to the deeply reverent, their prayers to the ancient, to the sacred, and to the Muslim offers of the surrender, which were conveyed to the Crusader camp through the intermediaries, were the generous, the honorable, and the deeply tempting, the Sultan the willing to allow the Christian army to withdraw, to evacuate Damietta, and to return to the Holy Land, in exchange for the promise of the peace and the truce. The terms, which were far more lenient than the Crusaders had any right to expect, were the reflection of Al-Kamil's pragmatism, his desire to end the costly, the draining, and the deeply destabilizing war, and his recognition that the total, the absolute, and the utterly humiliating destruction of the Crusader army, while the tempting, was not necessarily the most advantageous outcome. The Templars, who were the realists and the pragmatists, were the most vocal and the most insistent advocates for the acceptance of the terms, their Grand Master the arguing, with the desperate, the urgent, and the deeply compelling logic, that the surrender was the only, the possible, and the absolutely essential means of saving the remnants of the army from the complete, the catastrophic, and the utterly fatal annihilation. The negotiations for the surrender, which were conducted in the late August of 1221, were a delicate, a humiliating, and a deeply painful process, the Crusader leaders forced to accept the terms that were the dictated, the imposed, and the utterly non-negotiable. King John of Brienne, who was the experienced, the pragmatic, and the deeply realistic commander, was the primary, the most effective, and the most respected of the Christian negotiators, his authority the restored, his counsel the finally, belatedly, and tragically heeded, his presence the calm, the steady, and the deeply reassuring. The papal legate Pelagius, who was the broken, the humiliated, and the utterly discredited, was the silent, the sullen, and the deeply resentful figure on the margins of the negotiations, his dreams of the glory and the triumph the shattered, his reputation the ruined, his legacy the disaster, the catastrophe, and the deeply lasting stain. The Templar role in the negotiations was the essential, the constructive, and the deeply honorable, the white-mantled knights serving as the intermediaries, the guarantors, and the trusted, respected, and deeply credible representatives of the Christian cause. The Grand Master, Peter de Montagu, who was the known and the respected by the Sultan and his advisors, was the key, the crucial, and the deeply effective negotiator. His calm, his dignity, and his unwavering commitment to the preservation of the Crusader army the qualities that earned him the respect of the enemy and the gratitude of his own, desperate, and deeply humiliated soldiers. The Templars, who were the warriors of the Christ, were now the peacemakers, their white mantles a symbol of the mercy, the pragmatism, and the deeply necessary, the deeply painful, and the profoundly humiliating compromise. The terms of the surrender, which were dictated by Sultan al-Kamil, were the simple, the stark, and the deeply unforgiving. The Crusader army was to evacuate Damietta immediately, the city was to be returned to the Muslim control, and the truce was to be signed, the duration of the 8 years. The Sultan, who was the pragmatist and the realist, had achieved his primary, his essential, and his deeply satisfying objective, the expulsion of the Crusader invaders from the Egyptian soil, the preservation of his realm, and the demonstration of his military and his political power. The Christians, who were the humiliated, the defeated, and the deeply disillusioned, were allowed to withdraw, their lives spared, their honor the shattered, their dreams of the Jerusalem the forever, the irrevocably, and the utterly tragically extinguished. The Templar participation in the evacuation of Damietta was the efficient, the organized, and the deeply melancholy operation, the white-mantled knights supervising the embarkation of the troops, the loading of the supplies, and the final, the sad, and the deeply reverent departure from the city that they had fought so hard, so long, and so heroically to capture. The Templar fleet, which was waiting in the harbor, was the lifeline, the salvation, and the deeply reassuring presence, its galleys the crowded, the overloaded, and the deeply burdened with the exhausted, the wounded, and the utterly demoralized survivors of the campaign. The white-mantled knights, who were the last to leave the city, were the silent, the grim, and the deeply reflective, their thoughts on the brothers who had fallen, the dreams that had died, and the uncertain, the daunting, and the deeply unpromising future that awaited them in the Holy Land. The return journey to Acre, which was the slow, the somber, and the deeply reflective voyage, was a time of the mourning, the soul-searching, and the quiet, the bitter, and the profoundly disillusioned reckoning. The Templar brothers, who were the standing on the decks of their galleys, were the gazing back at the receding, the disappearing, and the deeply haunting coastline of Egypt, their minds filled with the memories of the fallen, the faces of the dead, the voices of the lost, the dreams of the Jerusalem that had been so close, so tantalizingly, so agonizingly close, and that had been so utterly, so irrevocably, and so tragically snatched away. The white mantles, which were stained with the blood, the mud, and the salt of the sea, were the symbols of the sacrifice, the failure, and the enduring, the unbroken, and the deeply resilient faith. The Templar assessment of the campaign, which was recorded in the letters and the reports of the Grand Master to the Pope and to the courts of Europe, was a mixture of the grief, the frustration, and the cold, the clear, and the deeply damning analysis of the failures that had led to the disaster. The white-mantled knights, who were the realists and the pragmatists, identified the causes of the catastrophe with the precision, the clarity, and the deeply unforgiving honesty, the fanatical, the ignorant, and the deeply arrogant leadership of the papal legate, the rejection of the Sultan's generous offer, the criminal, the suicidal, and the utterly incomprehensible decision to march into the flooded delta, and the chronic, the debilitating, and the ultimately fatal divisions within. The Crusader command. The Templars, who were the survivors, were the witnesses to the folly, the greed, and the fanaticism that had destroyed the Fifth Crusade. The Templar Rearguard actions during the final, desperate days of the Crusader retreat were the stuff of the legend, the poetry, and the deeply inspiring, the profoundly tragic, and the utterly heroic military history. The white-mantled knights, who were fighting with a desperate, a suicidal, and a deeply magnificent courage, held off the Muslim attacks that threatened to destroy the retreating, the vulnerable, and the utterly demoralized Christian columns. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who was leading his knights from the front, was a figure of the immense, the towering, and the deeply moving heroism, his sword the flashing, his voice the hoarse, the commanding, and the deeply reassuring, his presence the anchor, the inspiration, and the deeply beloved center of the Templar resistance. The specific engagements of the Templar Rearguard, which were fought in the swamps, the rice paddies, and the narrow, the treacherous, and the deeply deadly causeways of the Delta, were the countless, the unrecorded, and the deeply heroic, the white-mantled knights sacrificing themselves, their lives, and their sacred honor to protect their brothers, their comrades, and the remnants of the Christian army. The names of the fallen, which were the recorded in the rolls of the order and the chronicles of the campaign, were the testament to the courage, the sacrifice, and the deeply inspiring fidelity of the Templar brothers. Their white mantles the shrouds, their bodies the buried in the mud and the water of the Nile, their souls the commended to the God whom they had served with the absolute, the unwavering, and the deeply sacred devotion. The casualties that the Templar order suffered during the final retreat were the catastrophic, the devastating, and the deeply mourned, a blow to the fighting strength of the order that was the comparable, in its severity, and its long-term consequences, to the losses of Hattin and the siege of Acre. The white-mantled knights, who were the irreplaceable, the invaluable, and the deeply beloved brothers, were the fallen in the hundreds, their bodies the lost, their names the recorded only in the fading, the scattered, and the deeply precious memory of their surviving comrades. The Grand Master, who was the survived the campaign, was the deeply, the profoundly, and the permanently grieved, his heart to the broken, his spirit to the wounded, his faith to the tested, the shaken, and the ultimately, the deeply, and the profoundly resilient. The Muslim chivalry that was displayed during the final stages of the retreat was a surprising, a deeply impressive, and a profoundly humanizing aspect of the catastrophe, a reminder that even in the midst of the bitter, the brutal, and the deeply dehumanizing holy war, the bonds of the honor, the respect, and the shared humanity could, on the occasions, transcend the divisions of the faith and the hatred. Sultan al-Kamil, who was the victorious, the triumphant, and the deeply satisfied commander, ordered his soldiers to treat the defeated, the retreating, and the utterly humiliated crusaders with the restraint, the dignity, and the deeply surprising generosity, his actions a reflection of his own personal chivalry, his political pragmatism, and his deep, authentic, and genuinely admirable respect for the courage and the sacrifice of his enemies. The Templar respect for al-Kamil, which was the grudging, the genuine, and the deeply held, was a reflection of the order's long, experienced, and deeply pragmatic understanding of the Muslim enemy, an understanding that was based not on the demonization and the hatred, but on the cold, the clear, and the deeply realistic assessment of the individual character and the military capability. The white-mantled knights, who had fought the Sultan and his army for the months, who had witnessed his strategic genius, his political skill, and his personal chivalry, were the deeply impressed, the profoundly respectful, and the genuinely, if reluctantly, admiring. The Templar chronicles, which were the record of the campaign, speak of al-Kamil with a respect that was the rare, the notable, and the deeply significant, a testament to the Sultan's character and to the Templar commitment to the truth and the honor, even in the face of the defeat and the humiliation. The final, bitter irony of the Templar Rearguard was that the white-mantled knights, who had fought so heroically, who had sacrificed so much, and who had saved the remnants of the Christian army from the complete, the catastrophic, and the utterly fatal annihilation, were the witnesses to the complete, the absolute, and the utterly humiliating failure of the crusade that they had served with such devotion. The Fifth Crusade, which had begun with such high hopes, such grand ambitions, and such fervent prayers, had ended not with the recovery of Jerusalem, not with the triumph over the infidel, but with the retreat, the surrender, and the shame. The Templars, who were the warriors of the Christ, were the guardians of the Holy Land, were the defenders of the faith, were the survivors of the catastrophe, their white mantles a symbol of the courage, the sacrifice, and the enduring, the unbroken, and the deeply resilient hope that, one day, the holy war would be renewed and the holy city would be recovered. The return to Acre, which was the final, the somber, and the deeply melancholy chapter of the Fifth Crusade, was a journey of the exhaustion, the grief, and the profound, the bitter, and the deeply disillusioned reflection. The Templar galleys, which were the carrying the remnants of the white-mantled knights, the survivors of the Delta, the ghosts of the fallen, sailed into the familiar, the reassuring, and the deeply poignant harbor of the Crusader capital, their decks to the crowded, the silent, and the deeply mournful. The city of Acre, which had been the Templar headquarters for over 3 decades, was now the refuge, the sanctuary, and the deeply uncertain home of the order that had been so grievously, so catastrophically, and so tragically diminished. The reception of the returning crusaders in Acre was a mixture of the relief, the gratitude, and the deep, the bitter, and the profoundly disillusioned disappointment. The population of the city, which was composed of the merchants, the pilgrims, and the settlers who had been the praying, the hoping, and the deeply longing for the news of the victory and the recovery of Jerusalem, was greeted the returning soldiers with the cheers, the tears, and the deeply heartfelt, the profoundly sincere, and the utterly sorrowful welcome. The Templar brothers, who were disembarking from their galleys, were the silent, the grim, and the deeply exhausted, their white mantles the stained, the tattered, and the deeply poignant symbols of the sacrifice and the failure, their eyes the hollow, the haunted, and the deeply, the profoundly, and the permanently marked by the horrors they had witnessed. The Templar debriefing and the assessment of the campaign, which were conducted in the chapter house of the Acre fortress, were a thorough, a ruthless, and a deeply painful process, the white-mantled knights analyzing the failures, the mistakes, and the catastrophic, the devastating, and the utterly avoidable errors that had led to the disaster. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, who was presiding over the somber, the quiet, and the deeply reflective assembly, was the calm, the measured, and the deeply sorrowful, his voice the steady, his words the clear, his analysis the damning, his conclusions the stark, the uncompromising, and the deeply unsettling. The Templars, who were the realists and the pragmatists, identified the causes of the catastrophe with the honesty, the clarity, and the deeply painful self-awareness, the fanatical, the ignorant, and the deeply arrogant leadership of the Papal Legate, the rejection of the Sultan's offer, the suicidal march into the Delta, and the chronic, the debilitating, and the ultimately fatal divisions within the Crusader command. The impact of the defeat on the Templar morale, which was already strained by the decades of the grinding, the frustrating, and the deeply disappointing defensive warfare, was a profound, a devastating, and a deeply lasting blow. The white-mantled knights, who had been the champions of the Crusader kingdom, the guardians of the Holy Land, and the most loyal, the most devoted, and the most indispensable servants of the papacy, were now the deeply disillusioned, the profoundly weary, and the increasingly, the desperately, the hopelessly pessimistic about the future of the Christian presence in the East. The Fifth Crusade, which had been the great, the glorious, and the deeply hoped-for opportunity to reverse the decline and to recover the Holy City, had been the disaster, the catastrophe, and the deeply humiliating failure, a failure that had cost the Order the irreplaceable, the invaluable, and the deeply beloved brothers, and that had left the Crusader kingdom even more vulnerable, even more isolated, and even more dependent on the unreliable, the unpredictable, and the deeply disappointing support of the European powers. The Templar financial losses from the campaign, which were the immense, the devastating, and the deeply damaging, were a further, a serious, and a deeply worrying blow to the Order's institutional strength and its long-term viability. The white-mantled knights, who had invested the vast, the precious, and the deeply limited resources in the Egyptian expedition, the ships, the weapons, the supplies, and the treasure, were now facing the stark, the grim, and the deeply unsettling reality of the depleted treasuries, the exhausted estates, and the uncertain, the daunting, and the deeply unpromising financial future. The Templar Grand Master, who was responsible for the financial solvency of the entire pan-European institution, was the deeply concerned, the increasingly alarmed, and the utterly powerless to reverse the slow, the inexorable, and the deeply ominous decline. The Templar letters to the Pope, which were written by Peter de Montaigu in the weeks after the return to Acre, were a masterpiece of the diplomatic, the respectful, and the deeply damning communication, a letter that expressed the order's loyalty, its devotion, and its unwavering commitment to the holy cause, while simultaneously, subtly, and devastatingly exposing the folly, the arrogance, and the catastrophic incompetence of the papal legate. The Grand Master, who was the skilled, the experienced, and the deeply frustrated diplomat, described the campaign in the vivid, the detailed, and the deeply harrowing language, his account the chronicle of the suffering, the sacrifice, and the ultimate, the tragic, and the utterly avoidable disaster. The letter, which was carried to Rome by the special, the trusted, and the deeply discreet Templar envoys, was a bomb, the ticking, the explosive, and the deeply dangerous document that could, if it were mishandled, provoke a serious, a damaging, and a potentially fatal rupture between the order and the papacy. The role of the papal legate Pelagius in the disaster of the Fifth Crusade was the central, the dominant, and the most bitterly controversial aspect of the entire, tragic affair. The cardinal, who had arrived in Egypt with the grand, the glorious, and the deeply unrealistic visions of the total, the absolute, and the everlasting triumph, had been the architect of the catastrophe, his decisions the fatal, the disastrous, and the utterly incomprehensible, his leadership the arrogant, the incompetent, and the deeply destructive. The Templars, who were the realists and the pragmatists, had been the consistent, the vocal, and the utterly ignored critics of the legate's strategy, their warnings the prescient, the accurate, and the deeply tragic, their white mantles a symbol of the wisdom, the experience, and the common sense that had been so catastrophically, so devastatingly, and so irrevocably rejected. The specific decisions of Pelagius that led to the disaster were the numerous, the damning, and the deeply instructive, a catalogue of the strategic, the tactical, and the logistical errors that would be studied, the analyzed, and the deeply lamented by the future generations of the military historians. The rejection of the Sultan's offer, which was the first, the greatest, and the most unforgivable of the legate's mistakes, was the product of the fanaticism, the ignorance, and the arrogant, overweening pride, a decision that threw away the chance of the peace, the recovery of Jerusalem, and the restoration of the Crusader kingdom. The order to march into the Delta, which was the second, the fatal, and the utterly catastrophic mistake, was the product of the same, the arrogant, the ignorant, and the deeply delusional mindset, a decision that condemned the army to the mud, the water, and the death. The refusal to listen to the advice of the experienced, the knowledgeable, and the deeply respected commanders, the King John of Brienne, the Templar Grand Master, and the other veterans, was the third, the ongoing, and the deeply corrosive mistake, a decision that isolated the legate, undermined his authority, and ensured the failure of the campaign. The Templar critique of Pelagius, which was recorded in the letters, the reports, and the internal documents of the order, was the devastating, the damning, and the deeply influential, a voice of the reason, the experience, and the bitter, the disillusioned, and the profoundly frustrated wisdom. The white-mantled knights, who were the survivors of the disaster, were the witnesses to the legate's folly, their testimony the credible, the compelling, and the deeply damaging, their white mantles a symbol of the truth, the integrity, and the unwavering commitment to the holy cause that the legate had so tragically, so catastrophically, and so unforgivably betrayed. The Templar Chronicles, which were written in the years after the Crusade, are the unsparing, the uncompromising, and the deeply damning indictment of Pelagius, a judgment that has been endorsed, confirmed, and reinforced by the subsequent generations of the historians. The papal response to the Templar criticisms was a complex, a delicate, and a deeply ambivalent matter, a reflection of the papacy's own, profound, and enduring contradictions. Pope Honorius III, who was the successor of the great Innocent III and who was deeply committed to the crusading ideal, was torn between the loyalty to his legate, the desire to defend the papal authority, and the growing, the nagging, and the deeply unsettling awareness that the Templar criticisms were the accurate, the justified, and the deeply damning. The Pope, who was the diplomat and the pragmatist, attempted to navigate the treacherous, the dangerous, and the deeply sensitive waters, his letters to the careful, the ambiguous, and the ultimately non-committal, his support for Pelagius to the tepid, the qualified, and the deeply reluctant. The legacy of Pelagius in the history of the Crusades is a dark, a deeply cautionary, and a profoundly instructive one, a reminder of the catastrophic consequences of the fanaticism, the ignorance, and the arrogant, overweening pride. The legate, who was the man of the book and the cloister, not of the camp and the battlefield, had been entrusted with the command of a great, a holy, and a deeply complex military expedition, a command for which he was utterly, completely, and tragically unsuited. The Fifth Crusade, which was the victim of Pelagius' folly, was the disaster, the catastrophe, and the deeply bitter lesson, a lesson that would be ignored, forgotten, and tragically repeated by the future generations of the Crusaders. The Templar determination to continue the fight, which was the reaffirmed, the strengthened, and the deeply resolved in the aftermath of the disaster, was a testament to the Order's enduring, its unbroken, and its profoundly resilient spirit. The white-mantled knights, who had been the grievously, the catastrophically, and the irreparably diminished by the campaign, were the still the standing, the still the fighting, the still the praying, their white mantles a symbol of the hope, the faith, and the unwavering commitment to the holy cause. The Fifth Crusade, which was the failure, was also the school, the crucible, and the deeply painful but the profoundly instructive experience, an experience that would shape the Templar strategy, the tactics, and the institutional memory for the decades to come. The strategic consequences of the failure of the Fifth Crusade were the profound, the far-reaching, and the deeply damaging to the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Crusader kingdom, which had been the hopeful, the expectant, and the deeply invested in the success of the Egyptian campaign, was now plunged into a state of the deep, the bitter, and the profoundly disillusioned disappointment. The resources that had been poured into the crusade, the treasure, the ships, the weapons, and the irreplaceable, the invaluable, and the deeply mourned lives of the fallen knights, were the lost, the wasted, and the utterly unrecoverable. The Templar Order, which had been the backbone of the kingdom's defense, was the weakened, the depleted, and the deeply vulnerable, its ability to defend the coastal cities, to patrol the frontiers, and to deter the Muslim attacks the severely, the dangerously, and the potentially fatally compromised. The Muslim response to the Crusader defeat was a mixture of the relief, the triumph, and the renewed, the aggressive, and the deeply alarming confidence. Sultan al-Kamil, who had emerged from the war as the victorious, the triumphant, and the deeply respected leader, was now the dominant, the unchallenged, and the deeply powerful figure in the Ayyubid world, his prestige the immense, his army the strong, his realm the secure. The Sultan, who was the pragmatist and the realist, had no intention of renewing the war against the Crusader states. His priorities the consolidation of his own power, the management of the rivalries with his Ayyubid kinsmen, and the preservation of the fragile, the precarious, and the deeply valuable peace. The truce that he had signed with the Crusaders was the honored, the respected, and the deeply beneficial to both sides. The Templar strategic reassessment after the Fifth Crusade was a fundamental, a root and branch, and a deeply pessimistic re-evaluation of the Order's position, its prospects, and its long-term survival in the Holy Land. The white-mantled knights, who were the realists and the pragmatists, recognized that the great, the ambitious, and the deeply costly offensive campaigns, the crusades that had been the central, the defining feature of the Christian presence in the East, were no longer the viable, the achievable, or the desirable. The Templar Grand Master, who was the cautious, the wise, and the deeply weary leader, began to shift the Order's strategy toward the defense, the consolidation, and the quiet, the patient, and the deeply unglamorous work of the maintaining the fragile, the vulnerable, and the deeply precious status quo. The Templar financial situation, which had been severely, dangerously, and potentially fatally damaged by the costs of the Egyptian campaign, was the subject of the intense, the urgent, and the deeply concerned attention of the Grand Master and the senior officers. The white-mantled knights, who were the masters of the finance and the administration, began the slow, the painful, and the deeply difficult process of the rebuilding the order's treasury, the replenishing the depleted estates, and the restoring the confidence of the donors and the depositors who were the essential, the indispensable, and the deeply precious source of the Templar wealth. The preceptories in Europe, which were the backbone of the order's financial network, were the instructed to increase the revenues, to reduce the expenses, and to send the every available, the every spare, and the every desperately needed coin to the Holy Land. The Templar recruitment, which had been the severely, the dangerously, and the potentially fatally impacted by the disaster of the Fifth Crusade, was the another, the pressing, and the deeply worrying concern for the order's leadership. The white-mantled knights, who were the elite, the respected, and the deeply admired warriors, were still the attractive, the compelling, and the deeply inspiring vocation for the young men of the European nobility. But the news of the disaster, the stories of the suffering, the mud, and the death in the Delta, had dampened the enthusiasm, the diminished the numbers, and the made the recruitment the more difficult, the more competitive, and the more deeply uncertain. The Templar Grand Master, who was responsible for replenishing the order's ranks, dispatched the letters, the envoys, and the preachers to the courts and the cathedrals of Europe, their message the simple, the urgent, and the deeply compelling. The Holy Land was in the desperate, the critical, and the deeply endangered condition, and the white-mantled knights were the needed, the essential, and the profoundly valued. The Templar diplomacy, which had been the crucial, the effective, and the deeply respected tool of the order's statecraft, was the intensified, the refined, and the deeply focused on the objective of the maintaining the peace, the preserving the fragile, the vulnerable status quo, and the preventing the renewal of the large-scale, the destructive, and the deeply costly warfare. The white-mantled knights, who were the experienced, the skilled, and the deeply knowledgeable diplomats, cultivated the relationships with the Ayyubid princes, the local Muslim rulers, and the Italian maritime republics, their negotiations the quiet, the discreet, and the deeply pragmatic, their objectives the modest, the achievable, and the profoundly essential, the truce, the trade, and the survival. The Templar military reforms that were implemented in the aftermath of the Fifth Crusade were a direct, a deliberate, and a deeply thoughtful response to the lessons of the disaster, a systematic effort to address the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, and the fatal flaws that had been so catastrophically, so devastatingly, and so tragically exposed in the Delta. The white-mantled knights, who were the professional, the experienced, and the deeply analytical soldiers, studied the campaign with the cold, the clear, and the deeply unforgiving eye, their conclusions the stark, the uncompromising, and the profoundly instructive. The order, which had always been the adaptable, the innovative, and the deeply resilient institution, was determined that the mistakes of the Fifth Crusade would never be repeated. The first, the most urgent, and the most essential of the Templar reforms was the renewed, the intensified, and the deeply rigorous training of the knights and the sergeants in the specific, the demanding, and the profoundly unforgiving conditions of the riverine and the amphibious warfare. The white-mantled knights, who had been trained primarily for the desert and the mountain campaigns of the Holy Land, were now required to master the skills of the boat handling, the swamp navigation, the construction of the temporary bridges and the causeways, and the complex, the dangerous, and the deeply essential art of the fighting in the mud, the water, and the dense, the impenetrable vegetation of the Delta. The Templar training grounds, which were located near the rivers and the marshes of the Holy Land, were transformed into the simulations of the Egyptian terrain, the brothers the drilling, the sweating, and the deeply determined to be prepared for the next, the inevitable, and the deeply anticipated encounter with the Muslim enemy on the riverine battlefield. The second, the equally important, and the deeply necessary reform was the strengthening of the Templar intelligence network, the gathering of the more, the better, and the more timely information about the enemy's movements, the intentions, and the capabilities. The white-mantled knights, who were the masters of the espionage and the surveillance, expanded the network of the agents, the informants, and the scouts in the Egypt, the Syria, and the wider Muslim world, their reports are the more frequent, the more detailed, and the more deeply valuable. The Templar Grand Master, who was the consumer and the analyst of the intelligence, was the better informed, the better prepared, and the more deeply equipped to anticipate the enemy's moves and to counter the threats. The third, the most controversial, and the most deeply resisted of the Templar reforms was the strengthening of the command and the control, the clear, the unambiguous, and the strictly enforced hierarchy of the authority that was designed to prevent the kind of the chaotic, the divided, and the utterly disastrous command structure that had plagued the Fifth Crusade. The white-mantled knights, who were the sworn to the obedience, were the reminded, the reinforced, and the deeply drilled in the absolute, the unquestioning, and the deeply sacred duty to follow the orders of the Grand Master and the designated commanders, a duty that was to be placed above the personal ambition, the individual judgment, and the deeply human, the deeply understandable, and the deeply dangerous impulse to the question, the debate, and the disobey. The Templar logistical reforms, which were the unglamorous, the deeply essential, and the profoundly important, addressed the critical, the fatal, and the deeply embarrassing failures that had contributed to the disaster in the Delta. The white-mantled knights, who were the masters of the supply and the transportation, reorganized the commissary, the strengthened the fleet, and the established the new, the more secure, and the more reliable supply lines that would, in the future, ensure that the Crusader armies were the adequately, the reliably, and the consistently provisioned. The Templar preceptories in the Europe, which were the sources of the food, the weapons, and the treasure, were integrated into a more efficient, a more responsive, and a more deeply effective logistical network. The Templar spiritual reforms, which were the quiet, the personal, and the deeply profound, addressed the psychological and the moral wounds that the disaster had inflicted on the order. The white-mantled knights, who were the men of the profound, the authentic, and the deeply tested faith, were the encouraged, the supported, and the deeply comforted by the chaplains, the confessors, and the spiritual directors, their prayers the more fervent, their penance the more rigorous, their commitment to the holy cause the renewed, the strengthened, and the deeply, the profoundly, and the permanently reaffirmed. The Templar rule, which was the foundation of the order's identity, was the reaffirmed, the re-emphasized, and the deeply cherished, a source of the strength, the stability, and the enduring, the unbroken, and the deeply resilient spiritual life. The Templar relationship with the other military orders, the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, had always been a complex mixture of cooperation, competition, and mutual suspicion. The shared catastrophe of the Fifth Crusade, however, deepened the fissures and added a bitter layer of mutual recrimination. The Hospitallers, whose Grand Master had also argued against the Legate's suicidal march, were nonetheless critical of what they perceived as the Templars' insufficiently forceful opposition to Pelagius. The Teutonic Knights, a younger order eager to assert its own identity and carve out its own sphere of influence, observed the failure of the Egyptian campaign with a mixture of dismay and a calculated reassessment of their own strategic priorities. In the cramped councils of Acre, the white mantles, the black mantles, and the white mantles with the black cross often found themselves at odds, not over the ultimate goal of defending the Holy Land, but over the painful, pragmatic question of how to achieve it in a world where the Grand Crusades seemed to be a thing of the past. The specific point of contention between the Templars and the Hospitallers centered on the acceptance of the Sultan's pre-march offer. The Templar Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, had been the most vocal and influential advocate for accepting Al-Kamal's incredibly generous proposal to return Jerusalem in exchange for Damietta. When Pelagius refused, and the army marched to its doom, the Templars felt a bitter vindication, a grim confirmation that their pragmatic assessment had been correct. The Hospitallers, while sharing the Templars' frustration, were more inclined to attribute the disaster to the legate's incompetence alone, rather than to a fundamental flaw in the strategy of offensive crusading. They remained more committed to the possibility of a future, better-led Egyptian campaign. This disagreement, subtle on the surface, represented a growing philosophical divide. The Templars were becoming deeply skeptical of any large-scale offensive action without overwhelming force and unified command, while the Hospitallers retained a more aggressive, if cautious, offensive spirit. The Teutonic Knights, whose presence in the Holy Land was still relatively new, drew a very different lesson from the debacle. They had participated bravely in the siege and the march, but their Grand Master, Hermann von Salza, was a man of immense political acumen. He recognized that the failure of the Fifth Crusade demonstrated the extreme vulnerability of any campaign dependent on a fractious coalition of European princes and an overbearing papal legate. Hermann von Salza began to look elsewhere for the Order's future, shifting his focus toward the Baltic Crusades, where the Teutonic Knights could operate with greater autonomy and build their own monastic state. The disaster on the Nile, therefore, was a catalyst that would eventually lead the Teutonic Order away from the Holy Land altogether, leaving the Templars and Hospitallers as the two remaining pillars of a crumbling edifice. The personal relationship between the Grand Masters of the Temple and the Hospital, Peter de Montaigu and Guerin de Montaigu, was a poignant detail that underscores the complexity of the situation. The two men were brothers, bound by blood as well as by their shared commitment to the crusading ideal. Yet, their institutional loyalties often placed them on opposite sides of strategic debates. Peter, the Templar, was the more cautious, the more weary, the more deeply scarred by the disasters he had witnessed. Guerin, the Hospitaller, was more inclined to seek out opportunities for offensive action, to believe that a decisive victory was still possible. Their fraternal bond was a constant, low-key counterpoint to the rivalry of their orders, a reminder that behind the grand strategies and the political machinations were human beings grappling with impossible choices. The practical consequences of these inter-order tensions were felt on the ground, in the defense of the kingdom. The coordination of patrols, the sharing of intelligence, and the joint manning of key fortresses all became more difficult, more fraught with petty jealousies and disputes over precedence. The secular lords, who had always been wary of the military order's power, were quick to exploit these divisions, playing one order against the other in the complex political game of the Crusader court. The unity of the Christian military front, which had been the great strength of the Crusader kingdom in the decades after the Third Crusade, was slowly, insidiously, being eroded from within. The disaster of the Fifth Crusade had not only cost the kingdom thousands of its best soldiers, it had also shattered the fragile consensus that had held the Christian forces together. The Templars, for their part, responded to this growing isolation by redoubling their commitment to their own, independent capabilities. They invested even more heavily in their fleet, ensuring they would never again be at the mercy of the Italian republics for transport and supply. They strengthened their intelligence network, relying on their own agents rather than on the often unreliable reports of allies. They deepened their financial reserves, building a war chest that would allow them to act unilaterally if necessary. The Fifth Crusade had taught them a harsh lesson. In the new, more dangerous world of the 13th century Crusader East, the only true security lay in self-reliance. The white-mantled knights, who had once been the vanguard of the great crusading armies, were becoming a fortress unto themselves, an island of discipline and preparedness in a sea of chaos and decline. The humiliating retreat from Damietta and the return of the defeated Crusader army to Acre in September 1221 sent a shockwave through the Christian community of the Holy Land that was, in many ways, more devastating than the fall of Jerusalem itself. The loss of the Holy City in 1187 had been a military catastrophe, but it had been accompanied by a sense of tragic heroism and a clear call to action. The failure of the Fifth Crusade, by contrast, was a squalid, avoidable disaster, a tale of arrogance, incompetence, and wasted sacrifice that left a residue of bitter disillusionment. The survivors who stumbled off the Templar galleys onto the docks of Acre were not heroes returning from a hard-fought campaign. They were the ghosts of a dream that had died in the mud of the Nile Delta. The mood in the city was one of profound, aching despair, a sense that God himself had abandoned the crusading cause. The population of Acre, which had been swollen by refugees and by the families of the crusaders, had waited for months for news of a great victory. The fall of Damietta had been celebrated with processions and prayers of thanksgiving, and the expectation had been that the next news would be of the capture of Cairo, the humbling of the Sultan, and the triumphant return to Jerusalem. Instead, the news that arrived was of a flooded camp, a starving army, and a humiliating surrender. The psychological whiplash was devastating. Families who had lost husbands, fathers, and sons in the campaign were left to mourn not only their personal losses, but also the seeming futility of their sacrifice. The faith that had sustained the crusading movement for over a century was shaken to its very core. The Templars, who had been the last to leave Damietta and the first to organize the evacuation, were confronted with the full weight of this collective despair. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to the defense of the Holy Land, walked the streets of Acre with a heavy heart, his white mantle a symbol of an order that had done everything in its power to prevent the catastrophe and had failed. He spent long hours in the Templar chapel, kneeling in prayer before the altar, seeking some kind of answer, some meaning in the suffering. The chroniclers of the order, writing in the quiet of the scriptorium, struggled to frame the disaster within the narrative of divine providence, concluding, with a sorrowful resignation, that the sins of Christendom, its pride, its greed, its internal divisions, had brought this punishment upon them. The demoralization of the Crusader army had immediate and tangible consequences for the defense of the kingdom. The survivors of the Egyptian campaign, who should have been the backbone of the kingdom's military for the next generation, were instead a broken and exhausted force. Many of the secular knights, their crusading vows fulfilled by their participation in the campaign, took the first available ship back to Europe, eager to put the horrors of Egypt behind them. The garrisons of the coastal fortresses, already stretched thin, were further depleted. The Templars and the Hospitallers were left to bear an even greater share of the defensive burden, their white and black mantles becoming an increasingly common, and increasingly lonely, sight on the walls of the kingdom's castles. The Templar response to this crisis of morale was characteristic of the order. The Grand Master did not offer empty platitudes or facile reassurances. Instead, he doubled down on the fundamentals of Templar life: discipline, prayer, and work. The training regimen was intensified, the patrols were stepped up, and the brothers were reminded, in sermon after sermon, that their calling was not to victory but to service, not to glory but to sacrifice. The Templar rule, with its emphasis on obedience, poverty, and the acceptance of God's will, provided a framework for coping with the disaster. The white-mantled knights, who had seen their brothers die in the mud of the Delta, found solace not in grand strategic visions but in the daily round of prayer, the familiar weight of the sword, and the quiet camaraderie of the refectory. They were, in a sense, going back to basics, rediscovering the austere, monastic roots of their vocation in the face of a world that had lost its way. The quiet, stubborn resilience of the Templars in the aftermath of the disaster was a beacon of stability in a kingdom that was reeling. The merchants of Acre, who had feared a complete collapse of the Christian presence, saw the white-mantled knights patrolling the walls and the harbor, and took a measure of reassurance. The pilgrims, who continued to arrive in the Holy Land despite the news of the catastrophe, found in the Templar preceptories the same safe haven, the same efficient hospitality, and the same quiet, unshakable faith that had always been the hallmark of the order. The Fifth Crusade had been a disaster, but the Templars, by their very existence, were a stubborn, enduring refutation of the idea that the Christian cause in the East was lost. They were the survivors, the guardians of a flame that, however flickering, refused to be extinguished. The long-term strategic consequences of the Fifth Crusade extended far beyond the immediate loss of Damietta and the humiliation of the Christian army. The failure to secure Jerusalem through the Egyptian gambit had a profound and lasting impact on the entire crusading movement, fundamentally altering the calculus of risk and reward for future expeditions. The strategy of attacking Egypt, which had been the cornerstone of Crusader planning since the days of King Amalric in the 1160s, was now thoroughly discredited. The Templars, who had been among the most enthusiastic proponents of the Egyptian strategy before the disaster, became, in its aftermath, its most vocal and influential critics. They had seen, firsthand, the logistical nightmares, the treacherous terrain, and the devastating effectiveness of the Muslim defense. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, advised the Pope and the secular leaders that any future crusade must find a different path to Jerusalem, though he could not, in his heart of hearts, say with confidence what that path might be. The Muslim world, and particularly the Ayyubid dynasty, was significantly strengthened by the failure of the crusade. Sultan al-Kamil, who had been on the verge of offering Jerusalem to the Christians in a desperate bid to end the war, emerged from the conflict with his prestige enormously enhanced. He had outmaneuvered and defeated the largest Crusader army in a generation, not through a pitched battle, but through a masterful campaign of strategic patience, environmental warfare, and political division. The Sultan, a man of considerable intellectual gifts and a genuine desire for a stable peace, used his newfound prestige to consolidate his power over his quarrelsome Ayyubid relatives. The crusade that was meant to shatter the Muslim hold on the Levant had, paradoxically, made it stronger and more unified than it had been since the death of Saladin. The Templars, with their extensive intelligence network, were acutely aware of this shift in the strategic balance. They watched as al-Kamil extended his influence over Damascus and the other Ayyubid principalities, his court in Cairo becoming the undisputed center of power in the Muslim East. The white-mantled knights, who had fought al-Kamil and who respected his abilities, understood that the window of opportunity for a negotiated recovery of Jerusalem, which had been briefly and tantalizingly open in 1219, was now firmly closed. The Sultan, confident in his strength and secure in his position, no longer needed to make the extravagant concessions that he had offered to the desperate crusaders at Damietta. The loss of that fleeting moment, a moment that Pelagius had so arrogantly and foolishly spurned, was a source of enduring, bitter regret for the Templar leadership. The failure of the Fifth Crusade also had a corrosive effect on the already fragile relationship between the papacy and the military orders. Pope Honorius III, while careful not to publicly blame the Templars and the Hospitallers for a disaster that was so clearly the fault of his own legate, nonetheless harbored a growing, unspoken suspicion. The Templars, with their vast wealth, their independent military power, and their increasingly vocal criticism of papal strategy, were becoming a problem, an institution that could not be easily controlled. The quiet defiance of the Albigensian Crusade, the cautious pragmatism of the Egyptian campaign, and the barely concealed contempt for the legate Pelagius all contributed to a growing sense in Rome that the white-mantled knights were not entirely reliable partners. The seeds of distrust, which had been sown in the blood-soaked fields of Languedoc, were watered by the muddy waters of the Nile. The psychological impact on the Templar order itself was profound and enduring. The brothers who had survived the Delta, a generation of hardened veterans led by Peter de Montaigu, carried with them a deep, ingrained skepticism of grand crusading plans and of the secular and ecclesiastical leaders who promoted them. They had learned, through bitter experience, to trust only their own discipline, their own resources, and their own judgment. This insularity, while a source of strength in the short term, also contributed to the order's growing isolation. The Templars, who had once been the vanguard of a united Christendom, were becoming a closed, secretive, and deeply wary institution, a fortress within a fortress. The Fifth Crusade, which had begun with such high hopes, had ended by teaching the warrior monks a lesson they would never forget. In the end, they could only truly rely on themselves. The figure of Sultan al-Kamil stands as one of the most complex and, in many ways, admirable characters in the entire history of the Crusades. The nephew of the great Saladin, al-Kamil inherited a fractured empire and a constant state of war, yet he proved himself to be a ruler of immense intelligence, profound pragmatism, and a genuine, if often unsentimental, commitment to the welfare of his people. His conduct during the Fifth Crusade, from his initial, astonishingly generous offer to return Jerusalem, to his masterful orchestration of the flooding that trapped the Crusader army, to the merciful terms he granted the defeated Christians, reveals a man who was both a brilliant strategist and a ruler of considerable magnanimity. The Templars, who had faced him across the battlefields of Egypt, held him in a grudging, deeply felt respect that is palpable in their chronicles. Al-Kamil's offer to return Jerusalem and the entirety of the pre-1187 Crusader kingdom in exchange for Damietta remains one of the great what-ifs of medieval history. The offer was not a sign of weakness but of profound strategic wisdom. The Sultan recognized that the Crusader presence in Egypt was a dagger pointed at the heart of his realm, a far greater threat than the loss of the Holy City, which was, for him, a matter of prestige rather than existential necessity. He was willing to trade a distant, relatively unprofitable province for the security of his Egyptian power base. The rejection of this offer by the fanatical Pelagius was, in the Templar view, an act of criminal folly that cost Christendom its best chance in a century to recover the Holy Sepulchre. The contrast between the chivalry of Al-Kamil and the fanaticism of Pelagius was a recurring theme in the Templar reflections on the campaign. The Muslim Sultan, a man who was supposed to be the implacable enemy of the faith, had shown mercy, restraint, and a genuine desire for peace. The Christian legate, the representative of the Vicar of Christ, had displayed arrogance, ignorance, and a reckless disregard for human life. This uncomfortable inversion of the expected moral order was not lost on the white-mantled knights. It reinforced their growing conviction that the crusading ideal had been corrupted, that the Church's leadership had lost its moral compass, and that the true Christian virtues of humility, prudence, and mercy were more often to be found in the actions of the individual soldier than in the grandiose pronouncements of the papal court. The relationship between the Templars and Al-Kamil evolved into a cautious, pragmatic, and mutually beneficial partnership in the years following the Crusade. The white-mantled knights, with their extensive commercial network, their diplomatic skills, and their reputation for honest dealing, were the natural intermediaries between the Crusader kingdom and the Ayyubid court. They facilitated trade, negotiated the release of prisoners, and maintained the back-channel communications that were essential for managing the fragile, periodic truces that punctuated the endless frontier war. The Templar Grand Master, who had faced Al-Kamil as an adversary, came to deal with him as a respected, if still potentially hostile, counterpart. This pragmatic accommodation, while essential for the survival of the Crusader kingdom, further alienated the Templars from the more fanatical elements of the crusading movement, who saw any negotiation with the infidel as a betrayal. Al-Kamil's legacy, for the Templars, was a complex one. He was the enemy who had defeated them, the Sultan who had humiliated the Christian army and dashed their hopes of recovering Jerusalem. But he was also the ruler who had shown them mercy when they were at his mercy, the adversary who had earned their respect through his courage, his intelligence, and his honor. He was, in a strange and paradoxical way, a mirror image of the ideal Templar commander, pragmatic, disciplined, deeply committed to his faith, and utterly dedicated to the defense of his realm. The white-mantled knights, who were trained to see the world in terms of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, were forced, in their dealings with Al-Kamil, to confront the uncomfortable reality that the world was far more complex and that honor and virtue could be found on both sides of the religious divide. The military and logistical lessons of the Fifth Crusade were burned into the institutional memory of the Templar Order with the searing intensity of a brand. The white-mantled knights, who prided themselves on their professionalism and their ability to learn from experience, conducted a thorough, uncompromising post-mortem of the campaign. The failures identified were stark, and the reforms implemented in their wake were sweeping. The first, most glaring lesson was the absolute necessity of unified command and the catastrophic danger of allowing a non-military figure, however elevated his spiritual authority, to dictate tactical decisions. The Templar Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, became a fierce and influential advocate for the principle that the army in the field must be commanded by a single, experienced soldier, answerable only to God and the Pope, and that all political and spiritual advisors must be subordinate to that commander's strategic judgment. The second great lesson was the vital importance of understanding terrain, climate, and the seasonal rhythms of the campaign theater. The march into the Delta during the flood season had been an act of suicidal ignorance. The Templars, who had extensive experience in the region, had warned of the dangers, but their warnings had been ignored. In the future, the order resolved, Its own engineers and scouts would have the final say on the feasibility of any military movement. The Templar archives were expanded to include detailed, regularly updated reports on the hydrology of the Nile, the state of the canals and dams, and the patterns of the seasonal winds. The white-mantled knights would never again allow a crusader army to be led into a trap that the local Templar commander knew was there. The third lesson concerned the vulnerability of a static, besieging army to harassment, disease, and the cutting of supply lines. The long siege of Damietta had been a nightmare of epidemics and famine, even before the final disaster. The Templars recognized that future crusades would need to be faster, more mobile, and less dependent on massive, vulnerable supply depots. The order began to invest more heavily in its fleet, not just for transport but for the rapid projection of power and the flexible resupply of forces on the move. The Templar Navy, already the most formidable Christian force in the eastern Mediterranean, was expanded and modernized, its galleys becoming floating fortresses capable of supporting amphibious operations and raiding the enemy coast with devastating speed. The static siege warfare that had consumed so many lives at Acre and Damietta was to be, if possible, a thing of the past. The logistical reforms extended to the very heart of the Templar financial system. The cost of the Egyptian campaign had been immense, and the loss of so much equipment, treasure, and manpower had been a severe blow. The Templar treasurers, working with the Grand Master, developed more robust systems for the rapid transfer of funds, the pre-positioning of supplies, and the insurance of expensive assets like siege engines and war horses. The network of European preceptories was instructed to maintain larger reserves of cash and material, ready to be shipped to the Holy Land on short notice. The financial independence that had always been a Templar strength was now seen as an existential necessity. The order could not, and would not, depend on the unreliable promises of kings and popes. It would fund its own wars, and it would do so from its own, carefully managed and fiercely protected, resources. These reforms, born of the disaster on the Nile, transformed the Templar Order into an even more formidable, self-contained, and professional military institution. But they also deepened the Order's sense of separation from the rest of the crusading movement. The white-mantled knights, who had always been an elite, were now an elite within an elite, a core of hardened, pragmatic, and deeply skeptical professionals who looked upon the enthusiasm of newly arrived crusaders with a weary, knowing eye. They had learned the hard way that faith, without discipline, without intelligence, and without a cold, clear-eyed understanding of the enemy and the terrain, was a recipe for disaster. The Fifth Crusade had been the school of hard knocks for the Temple, and the lessons, though paid for in blood, would not be forgotten. The European response to the failure of the Fifth Crusade was a mixture of shock, recrimination, and a stubborn, if increasingly desperate, determination to try again. Pope Honorius III, who had invested his papacy in the success of the expedition, was devastated by the news of the surrender. His legate, Pelagius, returned to Rome not as a conquering hero but as a deeply disgraced figure, his reputation in tatters. The Pope, in his letters to the kings and bishops of Europe, sought to frame the disaster as a test of faith, a divine punishment for the sins of the Crusaders, and a call to renewed, more fervent, and more unified effort. But the rhetoric rang hollow. The princes of Europe, who had committed vast sums of money and thousands of their best soldiers to the campaign, were deeply disillusioned. The blame game began almost immediately, with recriminations flying between the French, the Germans, the Italians, and the papacy. The Templars, through their network of preceptories and their diplomatic envoys, played a delicate and difficult role in managing the fallout in the courts of Europe. The Grand Master, Peter de Montaigu, wrote a series of letters to the Pope, to the French King Philip Augustus, and to the other secular rulers, providing a detailed, factual, and quietly damning account of the campaign. He did not explicitly condemn Pelagius, but his narrative, which highlighted the legate's rejection of the Sultan's offer and his insistence on the fatal march, made the cardinal's culpability unmistakably clear. The Templar account, which was backed by the order's immense prestige and its reputation for honesty, was highly influential in shaping the European understanding of the disaster. It served to exonerate the military orders from the blame that some were attempting to cast upon them, and it focused the anger and the frustration squarely on the papal legate. The political consequences of the failure were significant. King John of Brienne, who had been humiliated and sidelined by Pelagius, returned to Europe a bitter and angry man. He sought, and eventually received, a measure of vindication, but his relationship with the papacy was permanently damaged. The crusading movement itself lost a great deal of its luster. The idea that a crusade, blessed by the Pope and led by his legate, could end in such an utter disaster, raised profound and uncomfortable questions about the divine favor that was supposed to protect the holy warriors. The preachers who were dispatched to recruit for a new crusade found that their audiences were more skeptical, more resistant, and less willing to part with their money and their sons than they had been a generation earlier. The age of the great, popular crusades was drawing to a close, and the Fifth Crusade, in its catastrophic failure, had hastened its end. The Templars, for their part, were careful not to gloat or to publicly condemn the papacy. They were, after all, a papal institution, and their very existence depended on the continued favor of the Holy See. But the experience of the Fifth Crusade had fundamentally altered their relationship with the papacy. They were no longer the unquestioning, obedient instruments of papal policy. They were now partners, advisors, and, on occasion, cautious critics. The Grand Master, in his correspondence with Rome, adopted a tone of respectful but firm independence. He would offer his counsel, his resources, and his soldiers, but he would not commit them to any campaign that was not strategically sound and commanded by a competent, experienced leader. The days of blind obedience to a fanatical legate were over. The Templars had learned the lesson of the Nile, and they would not forget it. The long, slow process of rebuilding the Crusader kingdom's military strength began almost immediately, but it was hampered by the loss of so many irreplaceable veterans. The Templars, who had suffered grievous casualties, focused on the intensive training of a new generation of knights and sergeants. The preceptories in Europe were scoured for promising recruits, and the order's standards, always high, were raised even further. The white-mantled knights who emerged from this crucible of training were, if possible, even more disciplined, even more professional, and even more deeply indoctrinated in the hard-won lessons of the Egyptian campaign than their predecessors. They were the inheritors of a legacy of sacrifice and failure, and they were determined that, when the next crusade came, they would be ready to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. The impact of the Fifth Crusade on the Christian community of the Holy Land was devastating and demoralizing. The settlers, the merchants, and the pilgrims who made their lives in the coastal cities had pinned their hopes on the Egyptian expedition. The fall of Damietta had seemed like the dawn of a new era, a sign that God had finally turned his face back toward his people. The news of the surrender, the flooding, and the humiliating retreat shattered that hope like a fragile glass vessel. The chronicles of the time speak of a deep, pervasive gloom that settled over the kingdom, a sense that the tide of history had turned irrevocably against the Christians. The Templar preceptories, which were always centers of stability and faith, became even more important as places of refuge for the despairing, where the quiet, steady discipline of the white-mantled brothers provided a stark contrast to the chaos and fear outside. The economic consequences of the failed crusade were severe. The vast sums of money that had been poured into the campaign, the ships that had been lost, the trade that had been disrupted, all contributed to a sharp economic downturn in the Crusader ports. The Italian merchants, who had financed much of the expedition, were now demanding repayment, their agents pressing the Crusader nobles and the military orders for the settlement of debts. The Templar treasury, which had been drained by the costs of the campaign, was under immense strain. The Grand Master and his financial officers were forced to make difficult decisions, selling off some of the order's more distant properties and tightening the belts of the preceptories across Europe. The economic engine of the Crusader kingdom, which had always been fragile, was sputtering, and the Templars, as the kingdom's bankers, were at the center of the storm. The political instability that followed the crusade further weakened the Christian position. King John of Brienne, humiliated and frustrated, left the Holy Land to seek his fortunes in Europe, eventually becoming the regent of the Latin Empire of Constantinople. His departure created a power vacuum that was filled by a series of weak, absentee, and often squabbling rulers. The Templars and the Hospitallers, who were the only permanent, stable institutions in the kingdom, were increasingly forced to act as the de facto government, their Grand Masters negotiating truces, adjudicating disputes, and managing the day-to-day affairs of the state. This political role, which the orders had never sought, further enmeshed them in the complex, corrupt, and often violent politics of the Crusader East, and it provided their enemies with further ammunition for the accusation that the Templars were a state within a state, a law unto themselves. The spiritual crisis that gripped the Christian community was, perhaps, the most profound consequence of all. The faithful had been taught that the crusade was the path to salvation, that God would protect his warriors and grant them victory. The disaster on the Nile called all of that into question. The Templar chaplains, in their sermons and in the confessional, struggled to provide an answer. They spoke of the inscrutable will of God, of the need for continued penance and purification, and of the promise of ultimate, heavenly reward for those who remained faithful. But the old, confident crusading theology was wearing thin. The white-mantled knights themselves, the men who had fought and bled and seen their brothers die in the mud, were living proof of a different, more somber kind of faith, a faith that was not dependent on victory, a faith that found its meaning not in triumph, but in the very act of steadfast, unwavering service, even in the face of overwhelming defeat. The Templar response to this spiritual crisis was to turn inward, to double down on the strict observance of the rule and the cultivation of a deep, personal piety. The daily round of prayer, the sacraments, and the communal life of the preceptory became the anchor in a world that seemed to be adrift. The white-mantled knights, who had once been the glorious vanguard of Christendom, became the quiet, stubborn guardians of a flickering flame, a flame that they were determined to keep burning, whatever the cost, until the end. The legacy of the Fifth Crusade for the Templar Order was a profound and permanent reshaping of its institutional character. The white-mantled knights who emerged from the disaster were a different breed from the confident, expansionist warriors of the 12th century. They had been tempered in the fire of defeat, and they had emerged harder, more cynical, and more deeply pragmatic. The lesson they carried with them was a simple, stark one. The great crusades, the mass expeditions of the European princes, were a spent force, an unreliable and often disastrous instrument. The future of the Christian presence in the Holy Land lay not in grand, ambitious offensives but in the patient, grinding work of defense, diplomacy, and the careful management of limited resources. The Templars, in essence, became the ultimate realists in a kingdom that was slowly, inexorably dying. This realism manifested itself in every aspect of the Order's operations. The Templar fleet, rather than being used to transport massive invasion armies, became a tool for commerce, for the rapid reinforcement of threatened garrisons, and for the occasional, carefully calculated punitive raid. The Templar castles, rather than being launching pads for the reconquest, were strengthened as impregnable refuges, designed to withstand the long sieges that the Templars knew were coming. The Templar diplomacy, rather than focusing on the impossible goal of recovering Jerusalem, was directed at securing the truces, the trade agreements, and the small, incremental gains that were the only realistic objectives in a world where the balance of power had shifted decisively against the Christians. The relationship between the Templars and the papacy, which had been strained by the Albigensian Crusade and severely damaged by the Fifth Crusade, continued on a downward trajectory. The popes of the mid-13th century, increasingly focused on their struggle with the Holy Roman Empire and on the consolidation of papal monarchy, viewed the Templars with a mixture of need and suspicion. They needed the Order's military power and its financial network, but they distrusted its independence, its secrecy, and its quiet, stubborn refusal to be a mere instrument of papal policy. The Templars, for their part, viewed the papacy with a weary, cynical eye, recognizing that the spiritual authority of the Vicar of Christ was often a thin veil for political ambition and fiscal greed. The mutual trust that had sustained the Order for over a century was eroding, and the consequences of that erosion would be catastrophic. The Templars' strategic focus on Acre and the coastal fortresses intensified. The city of Acre, which had been the Order's headquarters since the loss of Jerusalem, became, in effect, the Templar capital of the Holy Land, a mighty, fortified enclave that was the nerve center of the Order's military and financial operations. The great Templar fortress at Chateau Pèlerin, or Athlet, built on a rocky promontory south of Haifa, was a masterpiece of military architecture, a virtually impregnable stronghold that symbolized the Order's commitment to a defensive, fortress-based strategy. The white-mantled knights, who had once ranged across the length and breadth of the Holy Land, were now the guardians of a shrinking coastal enclave, their world defined by the walls of their castles and the horizon of the sea. The memory of the Fifth Crusade, and particularly the image of the armored knights sinking into the mud of the Nile while the Templars fought desperate rearguard actions, became a foundational myth of the Order's resilience. It was a story of failure, yes, but it was also a story of courage, of sacrifice, and of the unwavering commitment of the white-mantled knights to their brothers and to their cause. The veterans of the Delta, the men who had waded through the swamps and held off the Muslim cavalry to cover the retreat, were revered figures in the preceptories. Their stories, told in the refectories and the chapter houses, taught the new recruits what it meant to be a Templar, not the glory of the charge, but the grinding, unglamorous, and often fatal duty of the rearguard. As we close this chronicle of the Fifth Crusade and the Templar Rearguard on the Nile, we are left to reflect on a story that is, in many ways, the quintessential tale of the later Crusades. It is a story of high hopes and bitter disappointment, of grand strategies undone by human folly, and of the immense, futile suffering of thousands of men who marched under the banner of the cross. The white-mantled knights of the Temple, who had been the voice of caution, the advocates of realism, and the heroes of the desperate, doomed rearguard, were the central figures in this tragedy. They had watched, with a growing sense of helpless dread, as the arrogant legate led the army to its doom, and they had then stepped into the breach, fighting with a savage, sacrificial courage to salvage something from the wreckage. The disaster on the Nile was a turning point, not just for the Templars, but for the entire crusading movement. It marked the end of the Age of the Great, papally led crusades that had begun with Urban II at Clermont. After Damietta, the focus shifted to smaller, more professional expeditions, often led by individual kings, like the Crusade of Frederick II and the two Crusades of St. Louis. The era of the grand, multinational Holy War, the war of the entire Latin Christendom against the infidel, was over. The Fifth Crusade had been its last, best hope, and it had failed, not because of the strength of the enemy, but because of the arrogance, the ignorance, and the internal divisions of the Christians themselves. The Templars, who had learned the lessons of the Nile with such bitter clarity, would carry that knowledge into the final, dwindling decades of the Crusader kingdom. They would continue to fight, to pray, and to serve, their white mantles a symbol of an enduring, unshakable commitment to a cause that was slowly, inexorably, being lost. The fortress of Acre, which they had defended for so long, would eventually fall, and the last Grand Master would die in the breach. But the story of the Templars, the story of the warrior monks who had fought the rearguard on the Nile, would live on, a testament to the courage, the discipline, and the tragic, unwavering fidelity of the soldiers of the Temple. If this chronicle of the Fifth Crusade and the Templar sacrifice has moved you, if the story of the white-mantled knights sinking into the mud of the Nile, while buying time for their comrades has resonated with you, then honor their memory. Subscribe to Stories of Our History, ring the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Share this video with those who seek to understand the complex, tragic, and often heartbreaking history of the Crusades. The white-mantled knights, who stood firm in the swamps of Egypt while the world collapsed around them, are a reminder that even in the darkest hour, courage, discipline, and fidelity to one's brothers can shine through. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.